this time. The last two times I forgot to activate the microphone. That was glorious. Go. Let me know if the sound is too high, the music is too high, or anything. I am working with new settings. I recently got a new computer, so I'll need to get a costume and tweak my settings once again for the new quality I have. But beside that, definitely glad to keep on going. So we're on chapter 9, titled The Ascendant Frontier War. Band of Brothers had just returned from the first part of its Pendulum plan in Cloud Ring, and was now planning an invasion of Ascendant Frontier territory. Ascendant Frontier had recently unveiled its mightiest creation, and was well aware of the impending invasion. It didn't have a strong spy network, but it had sufficient informants to recognize preparation for a massive offensive. But with Eve's first Titan on its side, Ascendant Frontier pilots felt confident going up against the most feared military power in Nullsec. I quote, "I have been debating for several days now how much of this to share with the entire population of Ascendant Frontier. It's a hard decision, but one I have made. The day we have been expecting is close at hand. We will not launch a preemptive strike. We will allow our honorable friends and Band of Brothers to make the first move, if indeed that is what they have decided on." Sivok, CEO, Ascendant Frontier, on September 26, 2006. I quote again, "The time frame that was quoted was within 30 days, said Sivok, relaying the words of his informants to the rest of the Alliance in a blog post just days after the Titan was announced. However, if any of you have been paying attention, you will have noticed that Band of Brothers and the Mercenary Coalition have already moved at least 50 capital ships into northern Stain. They started to do this in a big way about 2 days ago. They have also been running freighters all over the southern regions loaded with gear and what appears to be entire hangars filled with ships. Axum Empire has been kind enough to be tracking and scanning several of them over the last few days. My personal judgment, they will hit us starting this Friday." Sivok knew that this alliance had the firepower and the personnel to leave Band of Brothers' entire fleet a smoldering rubble. It didn't matter that Ascendant Frontier had less skillful pilots. It had built such a large armada that it could lose 10 times more ship than Band of Brothers in every battle and still prevail. The challenge lay in convincing miners and builders to show up to defend the Alliance. It was all too easy for a player to simply not log in during a battle, or to ignore the fighting and continue mining, or to leave Ascendant Frontier entirely to go play Eve in a more peaceful location. Sivok knew that the challenge wasn't besting Band of Brothers in battle or firepower, but in convincing his civilians to fight, and to fight for Ascendant Frontier. I quote, "There has never been a force in Eve that has successfully built an alliance to the strength and accomplishment of Ascendant Frontier," he wrote in an Alliance-wide blog post. Again, never has an alliance of alliances been established in such a way that they act as one like that of Ascendant Frontier and Axiom Empire. Never has one organization been able to establish a feeling of belonging to something bigger than their own corporation like this group. Never has any organization ever done the above and remained honorable, honest, fair, and respectful to the rest of the Eve player base." End of quote. Well, there was an ominous tone to the letter. It ends with, "Corporations that decide to leave during this conflict will be immediately blacklisted." He fed them the carrot and then threatened the stick. Imminent danger. Sivok's prediction that Band of Brothers would attack on Friday, September 29, 2006, turned out to be exactly correct. On Thursday, the 28th, Sarmole posted the following cryptic message to the Eve forums. I quote, "As of today, the whole of Bob goes into war mode. The pendulum, with brazen din, proclaims the midnight. we begin to call to mind, ironically, what uses we have made of this dead day that drops to the abyss. Today, O date prophetical, Friday 29th in somber folly, maugre the truth of our heart maintains. We seeing still the light that saints have walked in ways heretical. The pendulum is about to swing, it begins. End of quote by Sir Molly, director of Band of Brothers, September 26, 2006. The poem is an excerpt from Clark Ashton Smith's Examination at Midnight, except with the date in the 7th line changed to Band of Brothers' date of invasion. Notably, Sir Molly posted this just 2 days after Sivok announced the birth of Ascendant Frontiers Titan and alerted his alliance to the threat of invasion. At this time, nobody else in Eve knew exactly what Sir Molly meant, but Sivok did, and he fired back within minutes. If you surrender now, we will consider letting you guys keep Fountain. Friday the 29th came, and hundreds of bands of brothers pilots massed in period basis. They began their assault on Paragon Sol, targeting the Ascended Frontier station near the border in GQ2S TAC 8. If Band of Brothers has been attacking from Mexico into the United States, GQ2 was like El Paso. The traders and miners that inhabited GQ2 saw their entire in-game lives brought to a halt. Everyone who flew out of station was shut down with the Band of Brothers fleet. An hour later, the Ascendant Frontier fleets showed up and set up defensively until their enemies left. This was just the opening shot, not a critical attempt at conquest. Hey Private, it was a test. Like two boxers throwing light, safe jabs in round 1. Nobody wants to get greedy and end up knocked out in the first round. The next day, as Band of Brothers fleets arise for round 2, Sir Molly posted a message to the citizenry of Paragon Sol in the local chat communications channel. I quote, "We know that you do not really want this," he wrote. "We know that you are suffering from the siege of your system. We know that it's hurting you. We will offer you a way out. The non-hostile way."
Oh man, it's Sunday again.
Oh yeah. Before we lay total siege to the system... Oh, I forgot.
Is that new?
I forgot one thing to put
Well,
myself in.
I just heard the last story. Feels like only a couple of days ago, and it's already Sunday.
Hey guys, I already started on Twitch and I totally forgot to put myself on continuous over here. So let me start over for our friends in the mumble. Sorry about that. I'm only in a couple of pages in, so we'll start over. And thank you very much for joining us. If you guys would like to go on Twitch instead, feel free to do so. I do think that the sound quality is a little bit better, as I do have some option to clear some of my background noise, but feel free to do it wherever you'd like. So we were at chapter 9 now, the Ascendant Frontier War. Band of Brothers had just returned from the first part of its pendulum plan in Cloud Ring, and was now planning an invasion of Ascendant Frontier territory. Ascendant Frontier had recently unveiled its mightiest creation, and was well aware of the impending invasion. It didn't have a strong spy network, but it had sufficient informants to recognize preparation for a massive offensive. But with Eve's first Titan on its side, Ascendant Frontier pilots felt confident going up against the most feared military power in Nullsec. I'm quoting, "I have been debating for several days now how much of this to share with the entire population of Ascendant Frontier. It's a hard decision, but one I have made. The day we have been expecting is close at hand. We will not launch a preemptive strike. We will allow our honorable friends," and that's in quote, "in Band of Brothers to make the first move, if indeed that is what they have decided on." Sivok, CEO of Ascendant Frontier, September 26, 2006. Still quoting Sivok, "The time frame that was quoted was within 30 days, said Sivok. relaying the words of his informants to the rest of the Alliance in a blog post just days after the Titan was announced. However, still in quote, if any of you have been paying attention, you will have noticed that Band of Brothers and the Mercenary Coalition have already moved at least 50 capital ships into northern Spain. They started to do this in a big way about 2 days ago. They have also been running freighters all over the southern region loaded with gear and what appears to be entire hangars filled with ships. Axiom Empire has been kind enough to be tracking and scanning several of them over the last few days. My personal judgment, they will hit us starting this Friday. Sivok knew that his alliance had the firepower and the personnel to leave Band of Brothers' entire fleet a smoldering rubble. It didn't matter that the Ascendant Frontier had less skillful pilots. It had built such a large armada that it could lose 10 times more ship than Band of Brothers in every battle and still prevail. The challenge lay in convincing miners and builders to show up to defend the Alliance. It was all too easy for a player to simply not log in during a battle, or to ignore the fighting and continue mining, or to leave Ascendant Frontier entirely to go play Eve in a more peaceful location. Sivok knew that the challenge wasn't besting Band of Brothers in battle or firepower, but in convincing his civilians to fight, and to fight for Ascendant Frontier. Quoting, "There has never been a force in Eve that has successfully built an alliance to the strength and accomplishment of Ascendant Frontier," he wrote in an Alliance-wide blog post. Continuing, "Never has an alliance of alliances been established in such a way that they act as one, like that of Ascendant Frontier and Axiom Empire. Never has one organization been able to establish a feeling of belonging to something bigger than their own corporation like this group. Never has any organization ever done the above and remained honorable, honest, fair, and respectful to the rest of the Eve player base." End of quote. But there was an ominous tone to the letter. It ends with, "Corporations that decide to leave during this conflict will immediately be blacklisted." He fed them the carrot, and then threatened the stick. Imminent danger. Sivok's prediction that Band of Brothers would attack on Friday, September 29, 2006, turned out to be exactly correct. On Thursday the 28th, Sir Molly posted the following cryptic message to the Eve forums in the form of a poem. I quote, "As of today, the whole of Bob goes into full war mode. The pendulum, with brazen din, proclaims the midnight we begin. To call to mind, ironically, what uses we have made of this dead day that drops to the abyss. Today, O date prophetical, Friday 29th in somber folly, maugre the truth our heart maintains, we seeing still the light that sains, have walked in ways heretical. The pendulum is about to swing, it begins." Sir Molly, director of Band of Brothers, September 26, 2006. The poem is an excerpt from Clark Ashton Smith's Examination at Midnight, except with the date in the 7th line changed to Band of Brothers' date of invasion. Notably, Sir Molly posted this just 2 days after Sivok announced the birth of Ascendant Frontier's Titan and alerted his alliance to the threat of invasion. At this time, nobody else in Eve knew exactly what Sir Molly meant, but Sivok did, and he fired back within minutes. "If you surrender now, we will consider letting you guys keep Fountain." Friday the 29th came, and hundreds of Band of Brothers pilots massed in period bases. They began their assault on Paragon Sol, targeting the Ascendant Frontier station near the border in GQ2S TAC 8. If Band of Brothers had been attacking from Mexico into the United States, GQ2 was like El Paso. The traders and miners that inhabited GQ2 saw their entire in-game lives brought to a halt. Everyone who flew out of a station was shut down by the Band of Brothers fleet. An hour later, Ascendant Frontier fleet showed up and set up defensively until their enemies left. This was just the opening shot, not a credible attempt at a conquest. It was a test, like two boxers throwing light, safe jabs in round one. Nobody wants to get greedy and end up knocked out in the first round. The next day, as Band of Brothers fleets arrived for round 2, Sir Molly posted a message to the citizenry of Paragon Sol in the local chat communications channel. I quote, "We know that you do not really want this," he wrote. "We know that you are suffering from the siege of your system. We know that it's hurting you. We'll offer you a way out, the non-hostile way, before we lay total siege to the system. Lay down your arms and drop down the sovereignty claims on the system, and you will be allowed to stay. This offer will go off the table in 1 week." In spite of the intimidation, the rank and file of Ascendant Frontier held their ground. The full weight of these two massive alliances came down on GQ2, but the early battles seemed to have been relative stalemates. The major factor was that Ascendant Frontier wasn't willing to put its Titan at risk. Psyvok wouldn't put it into the middle of a fight, but preferred to pop off a doomsday on the outskirt of the battle and retreat before the enemies knew what hit them. It resulted in only a handful of Band of Brothers ships destroyed. The timidity with which Psyvok was piloting Steve the Titan became a problem when Band of Brothers unveiled its own Titan, which it dubbed Darwin's Contraption, following in the theme of its main corporation, Evolution. These mammoth warships were still very new, however, and nobody knew enough about piloting them to be cavalier. Even Steve was only 2 weeks old. Rather than gambling on head-on attacks, Ascendant Frontier began sending fleets into period bases to attack while the bulk of Band of Brothers players were asleep. The problem was that this wasn't even Band of Brothers space. It belonged to Mercenary Coalition, which played no part in this war. Most people listed Mercenary Coalition as an ally of Band of Brothers at this time, but it worked hard to maintain its impartial mercenary roots. That said, you can make an argument that by allowing it to live in period basis, the backyard of Band of Brothers' empire, Band of Brothers had included Mercenary Coalition in a more or less permanent alliance. Not everyone in Ascendant Frontiers saw the mercenaries as independent, and some occasionally ran raids into Mercenary Coalition territory. Celine, the leader of Mercenary Coalition, had to work to stay neutral in this conflict, and sometimes that meant threatening military force. I quote, "Over the last several weeks, the leadership of the Mercenary Coalition and elements of the Ascendant Frontier High Command have worked very hard to maintain our mutual positive standings, despite the current political and military situation between Ascendant Frontier and Band of Brothers," wrote Celine in a message to Ascendant Frontier pilots. She goes on, saying the Mercenary Coalition has no stake or interest in the war currently being waged and has gone to great diplomatic lengths in order to maintain our neutrality. Yet, despite these efforts, some of your fellow alliance mates see fit to continue to push the boundaries of our patience and understanding. We are not looking for a fight. Quite honestly, as Ascendant Frontier High Command well knows, we have plenty to do without this nonsense, but enough is enough. So, to the rank and file of Ascendant Frontier, stay out of our home unless you want us to come visit yours. After the threat from Celine, Ascendant Frontier curbed its attack. The very last thing Ascendant Frontier's leaders wanted was to find themselves at war with Mercenary Coalition alongside Band of Brothers. Instead, Ascendant Frontier turned to a new attack strategy and began splitting its efforts. The order was to hold the line in Paragon Sol while a secondary fleet made its way through Stain and attacked Band of Brothers' home systems in Aquarius and Delph. These attacks led to no major victories, but it was enough that Band of Brothers had to bring its fleet home to push back the assaults. This served two goals for Ascended Frontier. First, it could annoy and tire the Band of Brothers' pilot, and second, its leaders could claim that the Band of Brothers on its back foot. From a propaganda standpoint, Ascended Frontier spun these attacks to say that this was now an Ascended Frontier invasion of Band of Brothers space, rather than the other way around. Propaganda is exceedingly useful at shaping the conditions before and after a battle, but it does little to alter the course of the battle itself once the missiles start firing and the lasers begin to rip through ship hulls. For a month, this was the war everyone assumed it would be. A stalemate. The two behemoths couldn't budge each other from their respective regions. Band of Brothers couldn't be bested on the battlefield, but Ascended Frontier barely cared. Its ships were replaced so fast that they might as well have been recyclable. Band of Brothers could hit with extreme force in one spot, but Ascended Frontier had the ships and the manpower to strike back in 3 different places. Band of Brothers attacked Paragon Sol. Ascended Frontier attacked Delph, Aquarius, and Fountain simultaneously. But eventually, the unstoppable force began to push back the immovable object. On October 29, Axiom Inspire home region of Impasse came under attack. It was forced to stop assisting its staunch ally Ascended Frontier in the defense of period bases. Without their strong military ally, when Axiom and Ascended Frontier split, many of the combat-focused corporation went with Axiom Empire. The volunteers and civilians of Ascended Frontier lost their grip on both of the major space stations in the region of Paragon Sol. Not even Cyvok's Titan had been able to turn the tide of the war thus far. A month into its life, the beast that everyone feared was being used too timidly to make much of a difference. Sarmoli's rhetoric was excessively self-congratulatory that day as he browbeat Ascended Frontier for not providing the challenge he'd hoped for. In the following quote, Ascended Frontier is referred to as ASCN, a common abbreviation for the Alliance. I quote, "In attacking ASCN, we finally expected to pay a dear price. An irresistible force versus an immovable object, perhaps. It is with great distaste that we found the first reaction of Ascended Frontier to our assault was immediately and unseemly panic. If there is anything apparent in this war so far, it is that Ascended Frontier is feeling the cold, chilling tendrils of fear creep into the hearts of their alliance. Upon the reptilian wings of this fear fly the specters that are so vivid that there often is no recourse but to deny reality and cling to illusions. It is the slow march of madness that follows next. A madness that strikes out at phantoms in all directions, mistaking them for manifestation of the fear in their minds. Yet the very source of the darkness lies clearly in front of them. They are just unwilling to face it. Fear is the mind killer." Love the Dune reference here. GQ2 and H8 TAC ZTO are ours now. They are the price you pay for believing that dividing a disorganized force and carrying out attacks with no purpose is a superior strategy to dealing with the inadequacies of your fleet. The division of your forces has only served to our benefit, as your various groups will then enjoy a mix of inconsequential victories and horrendous losses. Being governed by the fear of taking responsibility for a focused effort, your high command has chosen instead to cleave deep gashes in your ranks. Who is to blame now for the loss of GQ2 and H8 TAC? Who shall take responsibility? You have lost Paragon Sol, the name itself symbolic in that Bob is now as a paragon of the soul of war, fighting a leviathan that has no spirit. Bob does not trifle with unfocused attacks. We go straight from the throat. On the other hand, ASCN has only made enemies of alliances that were not even part of this conflict. The great sorrow in this war is that there are numerous members in ASCN that have shown the spirit to fight, yet are left hanging without support. The losses are not out of a lack of valor on the part of those in the front lines, but a lack of sensibility in those that give directions. Yet those alone are not harmful. What is harmful is that those deficiencies are coupled with a fear of accepting the need for improvement, fear for accepting the bewilderment of strategies, fear for being found wanting. Your warriors are ill-served, and they fall vainly on the field of battle. Sir Molly, Band of Brothers, October 29, 2006. Man, that guy's pen is great. This was how Sir Molly conducted wartime diplomacy. He cast shame on the leadership of his enemies while stroking the ego of his enemies' average members. This was his strategy for sowing dissension. He told the average pilots that they were brave, skilled, and strong warriors, that they were simply being led by fools. He tried to chip away at the fragile authority of Ascendant Frontier's leadership. Keep the faith. Faith here is written with F-E-Y, not quite sure why. Ascendant Frontier had failed slowly over the past month to turn back Band of Brothers. But it's important to know that Paragon Sol was backwater turf. It was a region where Ascendant Frontier more or less stuck its weaker allies. For the proper alliance, Faith Abyssal was home. It was where its journey in Nulset had begun more than 2 years earlier. It was the only region that truly mattered to its pilots. Its own alliance motto was, "Keep the faith." Oh, faith as Faith Abyssal, I get it. Ascendant Frontier intended to live up to that motto too. During the month-long war for Paragon Sol, it had built Faith Abyssal into the most heavily defended region in the New Eden Star Cluster. Practically every moon in every system was outfitted with top-of-the-line defensive star bases. The system for determining sovereignty was much different in this era of Eve than in the modern day. At that time, sovereignty of any system was determined by which alliance had the most star bases around that system's moon. The system became an alliance property when the EVE Online server reset at downtime, the 1 hour per day that EVE Online is shut down. When the server came back up, it counted the active star bases and awarded sovereignty to the alliance with the most. Because Ascendant Frontier had star bases around every moon, there was no single system that was vulnerable. Band of Brothers would have to fight several major battles to capture a majority of the moons, which meant it could take days or weeks to capture just a single system. Given that there are 89 systems in the region of Faith Abyssal, a traditional invasion could theoretically take years. On the home front, Sivok's biggest challenge was keeping morale high. He posted long missives sent to the entire alliance to keep Ascendant Frontier's fleet strong and its pilots loyal to Sivok's vision. I quote, "Since its inception, the Ascendancy has faced many challenges and created many firsts in the history of New Eden. We were the first to build a market in deep 0.0 space that rivals those in the heart of Empire. The first to build a new station in 0.0. The first to build a Titan-class vessel. Now, we are the first to draw a line in front of evil and say no more. We have built 40 new stations in deep 0.0 space, built a robust and thriving market so our citizens do not need to return to Empire for their goods. We have built hundreds of capital ships, a Titan, and tens of thousands of space vessels. Yet our dream is in danger. The great evil pushes against our borders with all of its might. It calls in help for the forces of darkness that reside in every corner of space. For nearly 3 months, the Ascendancy has held the line against the darkness another first. No other organization has ever stood in the path and not crumbled in a matter of days. The Ascendancy is looking for fighters, builders, miners, haulers, and free citizens to hold the line against the evil that consumes New Eden. Join us, fight at our side, and win your place in history. Be a part of another first in New Eden, the first to defeat the evil and build the new frontier. Cyvok, CEO of Celestial Horizons Ascendant Frontier, on December 9, 2006. The major theme of Cyvok's propaganda was to paint Band of Brothers as the great evil of New Eden. He mythologized his adversaries as borderline demonic. Reading his post to his alliance, it's clear he knew his people's weakness was confidence. In the previous post, he reminds his pilots of what they have accomplished. His challenge was to make them feel like they were part of a greater whole, because when it came to the skill of their individual pilots, Ascendant Frontier was sorely outmatched, and everybody knew it. Instead of telling his pilots that they'd crush their adversary easily, he tried instead to make this seem like a war worth fighting. He wanted his inexperienced pilots to feel like Luke Skywalker signing up to fight the Empire. The Fortress Faith. Band of Brothers faced different problems. Band of Brothers had crushed empire after empire, but it had no chance of breaking into the home region of Ascendant Frontier, Fithabolis. I quote, "There was no way to get in," Sarmoldi said in 2014. Fithabolis was a fortress. There was absolutely nothing you could do to break it. So we had to just add pressure and keep hoping that they would break internally from the pressure. With Fithabolis out of the picture for now, Band of Brothers slammed into Esoteria, the weakest of Ascendant Frontier's territories since it was still somewhat contested with another group. It hoped to be able to batter its enemies' morale, and maybe even crack its pilots' allegiance by continuing to conquer territory. The Band of Brothers fleet made steady progress through Esoteria and had the region essentially within its grip in a few weeks. It was now December 2006, and the war had begun to drag. For a sovereignty war, Band of Brothers had been making good progress by conquering most of the two regions, Paragon Sol and Esoteria, in 3 months. Especially given that the territory was being taken from arguably the most powerful alliance in the game. It also meant that the current pace Band of Brothers was on was unsustainable. If it took 90 days to conquer Paragon Sol and Esoteria, then how long would it take to beat down the Vault Door in Fithabolis? 6 months? A year? And that's if that was possible at all. Band of Brothers needed a foothold in the region, but its leaders saw no way of getting one. Ascendant Frontier wouldn't go down easily, and Band of Brothers could still lose this war. The key to victory was Fithabolis, and Band of Brothers pilots still needed to find a way through its iron wall. Luckily for them, they wouldn't have to wait long. They caught a break sometime in the second week of December. Knowing that it couldn't break Fithabolis through military might, Band of Brothers endeavored to put pressure on everything in sight in Esoteria. But it also meant using spies to their greatest potential, sowing dissension, clogging communications, messing up with Ascendant Frontier's ability to coordinate. Cyvok claimed his alliance refused to use these types of metagame tactics. Ascendant Frontier preferred to prove itself through engineering and combat inside the game. Band of Brothers didn't see it that way. That was foolish. I mean, you already know that your pilots are not as good. So you're already lost on that front. And you're just standing your ground on that front and dying on that hill. That's kind of weird. Anyway, one night in early December, a Band of Brothers spy managed to get control of the Ascendant Frontier star bases in 0OYZ Tag G, an important system in Fithabolis near the border with Esoteria. The spy shut down the defensive star bases in that system. which allowed Band of Brothers' fleet to swoop in and destroy them all with a surprise attack. As happens so often in Eve, a single spy achieved what hundreds of warships could not. With one swift motion, Band of Brothers had acquired the foothold it so desperately needed in Fifth Abyssal. But the tangential benefits turned out to be much more valuable than the capture of a single system. The Battle of C9N Tax CC. Ascendant Frontier needed Band of Brothers out of Fifth Abyssal, but its leaders weren't keen on a direct assault to reclaim that territory. Ascendant Frontier instead launched a retributory attack and took a different system, C9N Tax CC in nearby Esoteria, a crucial Band of Brothers staging base. Without C9N, can't pronounce that for some reason, Band of Brothers' ability to hit Ascendant Frontier was greatly reduced. Band of Brothers moved to take back C9N. Its fleet was small, only about 40 ships, but there were more coming through Esoteria to sandwich the 70 Ascendant Frontier ships guarding the entrances to C9N. Sormoli's Titan, Darwin's contraption, was the first Band of Brothers ship to enter the system, and he immediately attacked. The massive guns on the Titan incinerated a handful of Ascendant Frontier battleships, and managed to destroy a half-dozen more as Ascendant Frontier support ships gave chase, trying to jam the Titan so it couldn't get away. They were unsuccessful, and Sormoli managed to escape as the rest of the Band of Brothers ships made their way to the system in the chaos of the Titan chase. The two fleets clashed, and Sormoli turned his Titan around to re-enter the fray. Band of Brothers took the skirmish victory, and Ascendant Frontier retreated and regrouped a few planets away to gather its reinforcements. At the time, Titans had the controversial ability to remotely launch their titanic doomsday weapons from anywhere inside the star system. A friendly support ship could drop a sinusoidal field, effectively a wormhole, which allows friendly capital ships to warp to that point, and a Titan pilot could choose to fire a doomsday weapon through the Sino field. So if a pilot could get their ship near the enemy fleet and ignite the Sino field, the Titan could theoretically destroy that fleet without ever coming into attack range. That's so broken. Didn't know that. The Ascendant Frontier fleet was extremely far away, but a Sino field opened up directly on top of the Band of Brothers fleet. Sivok's Titan doomsday weapon erupted from within it as Steve the Titan's presence on the battlefield was now revealed. The blast missed. Band of Brothers ships scattered in the blink of an eye once the Sino field appeared, and only about 3 ships were destroyed by the doomsday. Sivok pulled back immediately, warping his Titan to a location in deep space inside C9N. The rest of the Ascendant Frontier fleet scattered to their own deep safe locations. A deep safe spot is a location far away from any landmarks or planets within the star system. They warp so far out that it becomes essentially impossible to be found. What happened next was a turning point in the history of New Eden. No one battle has had such profound effects on the Eve universe at large as the events in C9N Tax CC on December 11th, 2006. In this case, a mere 60 seconds were responsible for changing the entire shape of the game for years to come. Band of Brothers had control of the system now. Sormoli had retreated in his Titan to regroup with reinforcements. Support ships were salvaging scrap metals from ships destroyed in the battle. And one Band of Brothers pilot, named Valora, was patrolling and scanning the outer edges of the star system to make sure there were no Ascendant Frontier fleets waiting to ambush them. The minute that changed New Eden. At 4:15 p.m. GMT, Sivok of Ascended Frontier fired his Titan's Doomsday weapon and retreated to a deep safe spot. At 4:28, Valora conducted a third scan of the deep space area surrounding C9N and found Steve the Titan. Sivok was offline. Why is the timing important? Well, because EVE Online has a system called a combat timer. Whenever you attack, or are attacked by another player, a timer marks 15 minutes. Your ship remains in EVE space for those 15 minutes, regardless of whether you log out of the game or you are disconnected. It's mostly devised to prevent players from logging out as a tactic to save their ship if it's out of the brink of destruction. There was a quirk to the timer though. If a player attempted to log out before the 15-minute timer elapsed, the timer would reset. What happens next was the subject of controversy. The most commonly believed story is that Sivok was having some computer trouble and tried to switch to another PC. Either by mistake or by ignorance of the combat timer reset mechanic, Sivok logged out of the game with between 1 and 2 minutes left to go on his combat timer, initiated when he fired the Doomsday, which caused it to reset for another 15. The entire Band of Brothers fleet was Warp Team, and Steve the Titan was all alone, without its pilot or support fleet. The Band of Brothers Dreadnought fleet went into siege mode and began pounding on the lifeless hull of Steve. Sivok logged back in and found the entire capital fleet of Band of Brothers pounding on his Titan hull, and logged back out. It was over. 5 minutes later, the most expensive ship ever built in EVE Online, the first Titan ever constructed, and the flagship of the game's mightiest alliance, was in ruins just 77 days after it was completed. Its hull still floats in the space of C9N to this day, and can be visited by players looking to pay homage to one of the great wars of yesteryear. Video of the destruction of Steve, the Titan still survived, and shows the Band of Brothers fleet laughing and celebrating the kill while trying to maintain order, so Sir Molly could acquire evidence of the kill to show the rest of the EVE community. I quote, "Let Molly get excited, guys. The rest of you can shut the fuck up, please. Thanks," said Dianabolic in the video. 2 minutes later, Sir Molly posted on the EVE forums, "Titan down. Enough said." Sivok recalls things a little differently. And 8 years later, he still says the conventional wisdom, which describes the above circumstances, is false. He says he was cheated out of his title. He alleges that CCP developers who were members of Band of Brothers used their administrative privileges to find a Titan when they should not have been able to. He says he was kicked offline by those developers and prevented from logging back while his Titans were destroyed. It's an intriguing story, but it's not a version of events that I can find of evidence to support. The simplest and most likely version of events is that Sivok simply made a mistake and logged off too early. He had handled Steve with the utmost care until that moment when one tiny slip-up changed everything. Had he waited one more minute to log off, the Titan would have been saved. The details of these types of controversies and debates are not important. It's probable that the men and women involved in these stories will be fighting over details and minutiae on the forums for their retirement homes. However, the ramifications of this event are clear and indisputable. 2 days later, Sivok announced his retirement from EVE. A subordinate named Gon Gonkal made the declaration on the EVE forums. I quote, "By leaps and bounds, this is the hardest release I have had to write. Today, the Ascended Frontier lost not only a leader, but a good friend. Outsiders can say whatever they want about Cyvok, but I know him to be one of the most honorable, caring people I've had the distinct pleasure of calling my friend in over 10 years in online gaming. Cyvok made the Ascended Frontier what it is today. Without his leadership, Abyssal would be an undeveloped wasteland. Gong Call, Ascended Frontier, December 13, 2006. In an interview 8 years later, Cyvok recalled the decision to leave the Alliance in the middle of a war. I quote, "At the time it was a big part of my life, but I also was advancing in my career and I had less and less time to put into the game," he said to me in 2014. "I know it showed to my members, but it was a good, opportune time to call it quits. At least officially, I didn't want to, but that's the way it occurred. Everything after that is history." Cyvok walked away from the virtual world he'd spent thousands of hours in over the past 3 years. He handed the reins to a subordinate named Virtuoso. He left with complete confidence that the Alliance was in good hands and that the members of Ascended Frontier would keep up the tough fight against Band of Brothers. He knew that Ascended Frontier was the wealthiest of all Alliance, and that Abyssal was a long way from being conquered. The Alliance would be fine with one less politician. He was wrong. In EVE Online, there's an influential theory known as a failure cascade, initially developed by Goon Swarm's The Metani, which describes how large-scale social groups disintegrate. The idea behind a failure cascade is that a social group is like a stack of bricks. Remove a brick, and some others that relied on it for support might come tumbling down. On their way down, they might dislodge other blocks, and so on. The chief tenet of the failure cascade is that no individual in the Alliance knows that they are in the midst of one until it's too late to stop. After years of watching other alliances stumble, the focus in EVE Online shifted from military destroying your adversaries to crushing their social bonds from within. Band of Brothers never had any illusions about truly assaulting the battlements of Ascended Frontier headquarters in Abyssal. Band of Brothers instead opt to merely put pressure on the Ascended Frontier, testing the strength of its social bonds. If Ascended Frontier was like a stack of bricks, then Band of Brothers didn't try to knock the stack down with one blow. It nudged it persistently and waited for the bricks to start tumbling. Everyone involved underestimated the importance of Cyvok as a leader. While he was in command, everyone fell in line. When he left, it was like yanking the load-bearing foundation out from Ascended Frontier's stack of blocks. The ramifications were felt in every corner of the largest empire in the south. Ascended Frontier had put a strong front against Band of Brothers for months, but now it had to go through its toughest trial yet, a leadership change in the middle of a war. It was failing, almost instantly. The social fabric that bound Ascended Frontier pilots together began to unravel. Cyvok personally hosted the web discussion forums of all the corporations in Ascended Frontier, but he generally had a policy of staying out of other corporations' forums and letting them conduct their affairs in private. A few days after he left the game, though, he peeked in on several corporations to see how the Alliance was weathering the transfer of power. In short, it was a disaster. The leadership was weak and morale was at rock bottom. Cyvok found many Ascended Frontier member corporations scheming to steal assets and money as the Alliance went down in flames. It was like civilization itself was falling apart, and the citizens were planning which stores to loot in the impending chaos. To the outside observer, Ascended Frontier was in a troubled state, but was still a mighty force. But on the inside, it was obvious that the failure cascade was now in full effect and could not be stopped. Everyone was maneuvering their own corporation to be in the best possible position when the fall came. No longer was there any thought given to Ascendant Frontier. Sivok and Ascendant Frontier, it seems, were one and the same. When he left, the Alliance died. I quote, "I honestly thought that I wasn't the glue holding Ascendant Frontier together," Sivok said in 2014. In our interview, his tone of voice alternated between prideful and irritated, depending on whether he was talking about Ascendant Frontier or Band of Brothers, respectively. But now his voice took on a note of somber reflection. I quote again, "I really thought there were enough good leaders in the game, in the Alliance, and it would go on without me. The Alliance pretty much immediately fell apart. The spy-wrought foothold that Band of Brothers had previously gained in southern Fithabolis extended now to a string of 4 systems, all with important space stations. This chain of systems was only a small corner of Fithabolis, but it was essentially a bridge that connected Esoteria with its southern neighbor region, Omist. As Christmas neared, and with the Ascendant Frontier in complete disarray following the departure of Sivok, Omist fell almost instantly. The Empire of Ascendant Frontier was reduced to just one last region, the Citadel of Fithabolis. The structure of the Alliance had crumbled, but even with huge losses and departures, it still had thousands of loyal pilots. Massively weakened, and with its home region under assault, Ascendant Frontier prepared for the final defense. The hope was that Ascendant Frontier could make Band of Brothers pay dearly enough for assaulting Fithabolis that it would go home, content with the 3 regions it had already conquered. But letting the prey slip the noose wasn't Sarmoli's modus operandi. In his mind, he was Sarmoli, slayer of empires. Fithabolis would fall, no matter the cost. Faith must fall. With 4 systems in the south of Fithabolis under its control, Band of Brothers went straight for the jugular. Its pilots didn't want to slowly grind down the remaining 85 systems in Fithabolis. They wanted to take Ascendant Frontier home system in AZN TAC D2 and end the war. Band of Brothers mobilized its fleets for constant strikes against the Ascendant Frontier capital system. One night, at an off hour when most Band of Brothers pilots were asleep, a fleet was mobilized by the few pilots who were actually online under the command of a player named Blacklight, CEO of one of Band of Brothers' mainstay members, Black Nova Corporation. It was not an active hour for Band of Brothers. We're mostly European, but it was a strong hour for Ascendant Frontier, which was more global. A 40-ship Band of Brothers gang set out for the south of Fithabolis to raid the Ascendant Frontier home system in AZN TAC D2. The fleet arrived in the system, deployed a starbase, and started to harass the locals, setting up a makeshift blockade around the main station in the system. It took Ascendant Frontier some time to organize enough pilots to shoo the modest Band of Brothers task force away. The reason was that Ascendant Frontier didn't just want to shoo the gang away, but to crush it and send a message that these little raids wouldn't be shrugged off. The Ascendant Frontier fleet was organizing in a deep space spot far from the station and outside of scanning range from Band of Brothers scouts. Roughly 110 ships had gathered, including 25 battleships and 10 powerful dreadnoughts. The Ascendant Frontier fleet warped in on the Band of Brothers raiders and forced them to retreat to the starbase they had deployed. Ascendant Frontier, its fleet now revealed, moved into positions on the starbase and began to unload the power of its dreadnought siege weapons. As the big guns pounded the starbase shield, Band of Brothers stayed out of range and sent the word out to gather every available pilot into the system and prepare for a fight. Its leaders doubled their numbers, to 80 against the 110 Ascendant Frontier ships. The numbers were now somewhat more even. Band of Brothers had better pilots, but with but with its dreadnoughts, Ascended Frontier had better guns. Blacklight sent in a cloaked scout ship right into the middle of the Ascended Frontier fleet. The entire Band of Brothers fleet then locked onto that scout and warped directly on top of Ascended Frontier, unloading everything it had. Ascended Frontier had a big advantage in support ship and electronic warfare, and within moments the Band of Brothers battleship, its main firepower, was crammed and disrupted. They could barely move, but the order came from the fleet commander Blacklight: do not warp out. Stay in the fight. The fleet mashed together. Slowly the Band of Brothers battleships were able to recover from electronic warfare that had disabled them. They turned their guns on the Ascended Frontier's battleships and began whittling down their numbers, one at a time. All the while, the 10 mammoth Ascended Frontier dreadnoughts pounded away at the starbase. Blacklight did not want to be responsible for losing that starbase, and so with the battle still raging, he committed a chunk of his electronic warfare fleet to attack and scramble the dreadnoughts. Rather than cutting his losses and retreating, he took the big risk of doubling down on this battle. The superior Band of Brothers discipline was winning out. Ascendant Frontier battleships were now gone, and its support ships were now sitting ducks without the battleships to back them up. These were wiped out in short order, and Blacklight turned his eye towards the dreadnoughts. Ascendant Frontier had lost the main battle, but it started to regroup. It was after all on its home turf. A fresh Ascendant Frontier fleet arrived, and it posed a significant threat to the Band of Brothers gang, which was now weakened from the previous battle. The now smaller Band of Brothers force was trying to take out 10 dreadnoughts stuck in siege mode, but its numbers were so few that it couldn't keep them all scrambled. 5 of the dreadnoughts managed to escape just before destruction. So far, only 1 had been destroyed. The Ascendant Frontier fleet prepared to move in to defend the remaining dreadnoughts. As their numbers massed to crush the remaining Band of Brothers forces and save the siege ships, a beacon of hope arrived for the Band of Brothers fleet. Sir Molly had just warped in with his Titan, which they now named Evil Steve, to taunt Ascendant Frontier. Lag was running rampant. All the fighting and ship wreckage was slamming the system servers, and when Sir Molly arrived, his screen was blank. Nothing could be seen on screen, but a message from Blacklight came. Swiftly over communication. Fire, 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 fire the Doomsday, Blacklight screamed. Sir Molly didn't even know what he was shooting at, but he obeyed and blindly loosed a Doomsday weapon. 15 Ascendant Frontier ships were instantly destroyed, and the rest of the fleet retreated. They abandoned any hope of saving the embattled dreadnoughts, which were swiftly destroyed by the remaining Band of Brothers ships. This wasn't a battle that broke Ascendant Frontier's back, but experiences like this broke its pilots' morale. Even considering Ascendant Frontier's amazing achievement in production and engineering, it could not afford to lose multiple dreadnoughts to a small fleet it should have been able to best. Pilots simply stopped showing up for fights because there was just too high a probability that they'd end up destroyed. I quote, Paragon Sol has fallen. C9N is about to fall. AZN and Fetabilis looks nice for Christmas. The clock is about to shine for the last time. Ascendant Frontier Corporation, for those of you who wish to leave in peace and move your assets out, you have 72 hours from this post to arrange it, and you will never be offered this again. With the death of Steve and the evacuation of your leader, there's nothing more to hope for. Leave in peace, with your head held high and with something left. Or don't leave at all, with nothing left. Some may be refused this offer. Most will not. Your call. 72 hours are starting. Tick-tock. Sir Molly, CEO of Evolution Band of Brothers Alliance. Altered for clarity on December 17, 2006. Band of Brothers took AZN, and Fithabilis fell with it. The region's massive defense meant little when there weren't enough capable pilots willing to defend it anymore. The taking of Fithabilis turned into a clean-up operation. The hundreds of star bases in Fithabilis were now simply a chore, a mess left behind by the previous tenant. The alliance once known as Ascended Frontier was now dead. Its destruction marked the swiftest downfall of a major power in the history of EVE Online. Only 2 months earlier, it had been the predominant power in the south, controlling Paragon Sol, Esoteria, Omist, and Fithabolis. In its place rose Band of Brothers, which now controlled the largest swath of territory ever conquered in EVE Online. That was Chapter 9, quite exciting. Chapter 10, Fallen Frontier. Fithabolis, Esoteria, Paragon Sol, Period Basis, Quarius, Delve, Fountain. The entirety of the west and south now belonged to Band of Brothers. It was twice as much territory as any organization in EVE had ever conquered. The Brothers and their close allies now ruled 561 star systems. Band of Brothers was able to keep control of this massive amount of territory, despite having only between 2,000 and 3,000 members. By instituting one of EVE's first rental systems, it installed vassal alliances in its territory, which then paid taxes back to Band of Brothers in exchange for the protection of Bob's skilled fleets. Band of Brothers stayed in its home region of Delve, but the greater Band of Brothers community consisted of a half a dozen other alliances which were in lockstep with the Mother Alliance. When Band of Brothers took over Ascended Frontier's territory, it essentially left things to run as it's always had. There was a regime change, but for most players, it was business as usual. Many of the old corporations that populated Ascended Frontier territory were allowed to stay and join the Alliance as taxpayers with protection from Band of Brothers. Others were banished, usually because they had personally offended Band of Brothers' leadership. Even some of Ascended Frontier's military had given an offer to join the elite combat brigade of Band of Brothers. The spoils of war for Band of Brothers in its conquest of the South was a larger tax base and a swath of highly trained personnel. In the North, during the war against Ascended Frontier, a coalition had risen to power in the Northern Territories that was now at odds with Band of Brothers. For the last 2 years following the Great Northern War, the North had been splintered and divided between half a dozen minor powers. But that was beginning to change, when Band of Brothers and Ascended Frontier assaulted the North in mid-2006 with a great blockade of EC-TAC P8R detailed in the Capital Age. The leaders of the Northern powers began to take notice. Each individual Northern state was completely powerless against the might of superpowers like Band of Brothers and Ascended Frontier, and fighting a coalition of the two was laughable. But if the Northern state came together as one coalition, they would be a credible threat to even the mightiest alliances and coalitions. And so they joined together to form Dusk and Dawn, a new state that sought to fill the gaping power vacuum in the North and unite the tribes. Dusk and Dawn serve as the military backbone on which the other powers of the region could rely for support. The industrial groups from other alliances now had allies that could defend the entire North. The Northerners had huge numbers, but numbers are useless unless they have proper direction. 4 alliances of thousands of unskilled pilots might as well be made of paper if they can't cooperate in the face of a proper military force. But that changed when they became one coalition of 6,000 players acting in the common good under competent military leadership. It wasn't the finest fighting force Eve had ever seen, but it was able to amass huge fleets that packed so much firepower that skill and tactics were barely mattered. It was good enough to ensure their common defense. The alliances involved in this mutual defense agreement became known as the Northern Coalition. Mutual protection was only the first goal of the new Northern Coalition, though. Its leaders were building this group with the goal of eventually destroying Band of Brothers. They prophesied that it was only a matter of time until the political situation in New Eden wrapped up every alliance and a war dragged in every coalition in the game. With their new coalition working together as one, they'd be ready for this hypothetical war. By the beginning of 2007, the Northern Coalition was firmly in control of the North. Its forces had cleansed the region of pirates, and its civilians were moving toward a more prosperous future. Like true New Eden Northerners, the Northern Coalition pilots weren't interested in conquest. They just wanted to safeguard their own territory and had achieved the means to do just that. The Northern Coalition was now one of three major power blocks in New Eden, alongside Band of Brothers and the rulers of the Southeast, Lotka Volterra. Lotka Volterra, mid to late 2006, was perhaps the most critical and complicated time in the history of EVE Online. This is when Band of Brothers began its assault on the Senate frontier, but it's also the time when the many forces that arose as a result of the breakup of the Curse Alliance went to war. Within the span of only a few months, the mostly Russian group Red Alliance arose as a dominant force in the southeast, and then was crushed and removed from its territory. This is covered in depth in the opening chapter of this book, The Siege of SeaTac J6MT and the War for Innsmother. Just a couple of months before Band of Brothers would invade the Senate frontier, Red Alliance had lost a war against a swath of powerful enemies known as the Coalition of the South. The Coalition wanted only to remove Red Alliance from what it viewed as its rightful territory, and once that was achieved, it divvied up the turf and went along on its way. Of its members, Chimera Pact, Knights of the Southern Cross, Lotka Volterra, and Veritas Immortalis, Lotka Volterra got the best picks. It staked its claims way down south in Tenerifis, Omist, and part of Deterrent. This was rich territory, and it was far from the front lines in the north. Wicked Creek and Innsmother were still battlegrounds, but Lotka Volterra's territory bordered only in the Senate frontier, which, as previously mentioned, was largely isolationist and posed no threat of invasion. In his southern cocoon, Lotka Volterra grew wealthy and powerful. Its ranks included a corporation called Shinra that was known as one of the best fighting forces in New Eden, and now its new territory gave it a chance to build as well. While Red Alliance was making its stand at SeaTac J, several of the top corporations of the Chimera Pact voted to transfer and become part of Lotka Volterra. In the terms of the deal, Lotka Volterra was also gifted the region of Datorid and most of Innsmother. As the owner of 3.5 regions, Lotka Volterra was now second only to Band of Brothers in the breadth of its empire. But before we can move on to what happened in the wake of the fall of the Senate frontier, we have to briefly go back to 2004, because in 2004, far away from the Great Northern War, something happened that would change EVE Online forever. The Goons arrived in force in New Eden. Chapter 11. Enter Goons. Up to this point in the history of EVE Online, there is relatively clear progression of power. For the most part, those who began playing the game in 2003 had clear advantages over those who started in 2004. Their knowledge of the game was far greater, their pockets far deeper, and their hangars were filled with more advanced ships. However, that began to change in 2004 with a unique event, a migration. Many new players from all corners of internet began to experiment with Eve. All of the original powers of Eve Online migrated from different games that preceded Eve: Earth and Beyond, Homeworld, Jump Gate, Elite, etc. But this was one of the first major arrivals of new players since then. These types of players influx had been rare in the past because for about the first 18 months of its lifespan, EVE Online was sold in a box, in stores. The game was originally published by Simon & Schuster Interactive, a branch of well-known book publisher that dabbled in game distribution. But the interactive branch of the company was shut down. That meant EVE Online's distribution rights now belonged to a company that no longer distributed games. It took CCP Games some time to negotiate and buy back the rights to distribute the game. EVE Online was not yet a hit, and CCP Games could have simply let EVE perish and moved on to create a new title. But the company stuck by it and opted to negotiate for the right to continue working on their own game. CCP Games got the right back in its possession, but it was hardly capable of distributing a box video game internationally from its Icelandic headquarters. So the company decided to take a big risk. It began selling EVE exclusively through the internet. This gave EVE the ability to become a viral hit. On several different corners of the internet, established EVE players began recruiting others to join since they could now easily download it over the internet. This allowed for a new influx of players from many different backgrounds. No longer was every major player group a descendant of a different space-based online strategy game. One small group of players hailed from the forums of the site somethingawful.com, whose members called themselves Goons. The Goons that joined EVE Online would one day be legendary, but they began humbly. 8 failed dreams. The first Goon corporation was torn apart by internal squabbling, but the Goons reformed elsewhere as Red Hammer Industry, which was similarly shattered. But this time, it wasn't drama that hobbled the nice and good present, but theft. A goon with access to the main corporate hangar absconded with billions of ISK worth of materials, mostly minerals and mining yield. The thief was never caught, and the resulting fracas tore the young corporation apart. The next Goon alliance, called Free State Project, fell apart after a goon stole ore from a larger enemy corporation that then used the theft as cause to begin killing any goon they saw. The members scattered shortly after. And on it went. 8 times the goons organized themselves, and 8 times they were scattered for different reasons. Goon corporations in EVE have been a history of failed dreams, wrote Remedial, the Goon's first major leader. In retrospect, eventually a few Goons came together to form yet another corporation called Goonfleet. At its core, Goonfleet had several veterans of EVE Online, but the bulk of its membership were new players in the game who had been encouraged to join EVE by their friends at somethingawful.com. In a series of recruitment drives, Goonfleet pilots invited other goons to join the game. The organization didn't have grand ambitions of space conquest. The goons just liked to get as many people online as possible in the crappiest ships possible to see what they could pull off. The key difference between Goonfleet and the failed corporation they came before it was an emphasis on teaching beginners. Goonfleet lavished attention on players who just joining the game and took time to teach them the basics. While others in Eve would scoff at new players and refuse to recruit anyone who wasn't a trusted friend or a renowned veteran, the goons welcomed new players, provided they were true-blood goons, with a history on the somethingawful.com forums. The new approach to dealing with new players drove hundreds of new players to join goon fleets. With the direction of their leader, Remedial, more and more players joined the game under the Goon Fleet banner. The corporation grew to over 1,000 members, too large to simply fall apart from internal drama, and it became the sideshow of EVE Online. The veterans of EVE Online laughed at the naivete of this swarming pack of new players in terrible ships. Goon Fleet embraced this idea and co-opted the idea of the swarm. For its own self-image, its pilots adopted the mascot of a chubby, cigar-smoking bumblebee, wearing a World War I-era German helmet, which they appropriately named Fat B. Their battle cry: "We're terrible at this game." Maybe many in the EVE universe at the time wrote off Goon Fleet as a swarm of internet trolls, who just wanted to ruin everyone's day. There was some truth to that. The goons would openly use coarse language that made many people uncomfortable. To be clear, the use of slurs and other harsh language is common in many online communities, and EVE Online is no exception. What made the goons unique in the EVE community wasn't their use of this kind of language, but their use of it in alliance level communication and in leadership speeches. The goons refused to change the way they talked or acted, regardless of whether their audience was a few friends, a few thousand alliance mates, or tens of thousands in the wider EVE community. They mocked the pomp and pageantry with which other leaders at the time carried themselves. There was an authenticity to the blue-collar attitude of the goons, and it proved to be a great social strength of the organization. But behind the irreverent attitude, there was a social genius to the way the goons approached the game. In essence, their morale was unassailable because they deliberately underinflated their self-image. According to some sources, the name Goon was intended as a way of turning the stereotype of basement-dwelling internet cretins against itself by publicly owning it. The goons of EVE Online demeaned themselves publicly and claimed to not care what happened to their ships or their territory. This was in stark contrast to how things had been run before the goons' arrival in New Eden. For some of the best players groups in the game, pride was a resource. Skilled pilots could build up their egos after winning a string of battles, but it was only a matter of time until they were humbled. And when they were, the illusion of mastery could unfold and unravel the social fabric of the group. If your corporation is based on being the best, what happens when you lose? The goons prided themselves on being the worst, so when they lost, they laughed. When they won, they laughed harder. The goons represented a new crop of EVE Online players, and some of the old guard didn't like them at all. Groups like Band of Brothers tended to view them as disrespectful of the history and power structure of the game. I quote, "They had this attitude of, we can do whatever we want, we can say whatever we want, nobody is going to hold us accountable for our action," said Band of Brothers Sir Molly in 2014, who was essentially the most powerful person in New Eden at the time Goon Fleet was founded. But Goon Fleet was fueled by this dislike and began to see itself as fighting against the established order. Its leadership decided to actually buy advertisement on the Something Awful forums to attract new recruits. Goon Fleet's ranks soared and eventually reached 1,300 players, the population cap for a corporation in EVE Online in 2005. By contrast, Band of Brothers was the most powerful organization in the game at that time and had about 1,000 players. This isn't to say Goon fleet could have put up a fight against Band of Brothers. The Goons were still largely teaching their brand new pilots how to fly their ships, and trying to figure out exactly what to do with this absurdly large mob of people. Despite Band of Brothers' disdain for the Goons, when the massive Goon fleet began to take shape, many leaders of EVE Online's biggest empires took a liking to them. Goon fleet was a fun-loving and interesting group compared to the very serious alliances that populated Nullsec. But Goon fleet's reputation among the other major groups of the era began to erode. The most notable moment came when Goon fleet's leader, Remedial, had been seen explicitly mocking the real-world death of a Band of Brothers member. This attracted the ire of Band of Brothers leadership. This event would come back to haunt Goon fleet later as it continued to be a source of anger between the two. Cloud Ring. By now, Goon fleet had taken up residence in the region of Syndicate. Syndicate is ruled by a fictional in-game pirate faction. That's our region at the EVE University, guys. The region can be conquered by player groups, but the Goons bears their operation here. Syndicate was the crib of Goon kind. The Goons would say that this was where the little bees learned to fly. With constant trading, Goon fleet soon became a proper corporation, and its leaders wanted to take a territory in their own nullsec. Goon fleet's numbers had grown past the maximum limit for a single corporation. So the Goons started multiple new corporations under the alliance banner Goon Swarm, whereas most alliances were conglomerates of corporations from many different groups of players. The Goon Swarm was an alliance all to itself. With starry eyes, Goon Swarm invaded the Nullsec region nearest to Syndicate and found itself fighting NORAD, veterans of the Great Northern War, in Cloud Ring. The invasion went quite well for Goon Swarm. This was a minor event in the grand scheme of Nullsec drama, so the details are scarce, but the first battles were reportedly won by Goon Swarm. The Goons taunted NORAD and called them a waning power that could no longer hold its own territory. The leader of Goon Swarm, Remedial, made a private offer to the CEO of NORAD. Surrender this space and we'll give you 72 hours to evacuate your assets. However, Goon spies under the direction of their intelligence officer, the Mittani, discovered that the NORAD CEO never delivered the terms of surrender to the rest of the alliance. Goon leader Remedial deemed that this was a failure of leadership and decided to publicly announce the terms of surrender on the EVE forums for all NORAD members to see. It didn't go over the way he hoped. Other leaders in the world of EVE saw the surrender conditions as premature and arrogant. The surrender conditions were still rejected. The war continued and it hurt the reputation of the Goon Swarm in the eyes of other leaders. It was at this time that a member of Goon Swarm posted a crude, stick figure comic online depicting the death of the Band of Brothers players that Remedial was caught mocking and poking fun at Band of Brothers' outrage. The player named Vincent Van Wert, or Smosk in-game, played EVE Online with his father, who was still a member of Band of Brothers. The drawing was posted on somethingawful.com but eventually leaked to the rest of the EVE community. Band of Brothers was furious as the continued lack of respect shown for one of their own. Still today, Band of Brothers leaders recall this as a time they let their emotions get the better of them. They declare their intent to move north to Cloud Ring, aid the embattled NORAD, and put an end to Goon Swarm's nascent nullsec ambitions. NORAD itself also banded together with Northern allies as part of a new Northern military coalition, Dusk and Dawn. The other major power nearby, Ascended Frontier, located in the south, wasn't willing to risk angering Band of Brothers and aligned itself against the Goons as well. Operation Goonicide. After a month of battling, Goon Swarm was putting up a good fight in its attempt to take Cloud Ring from the newly formed Dusk and Dawn alliance. which would eventually form the military backbone of the Northern Coalition. But its opposition was too strong. The Goons had even managed to become the temporary owners of the capital system in the region XZH TAC4X, but Dusk and Dawn regrouped, took it back, and began sweeping Goon Swarm from the region. There were huge losses on both sides. Over 2,000 ships were reportedly destroyed in the war for Cloud Ring, but Dusk and Dawn Alliance had held fast. Goon Swarm sounded the retreat and evacuated its assets back into Syndicate. However, the furious band of Brothers' fleet was now on its way to Syndicate, and it was about to drop the full might of its established war machine on the in-battle Goon Swarm. The Goons had just lost a month-long campaign for Cloud Ring, and now would have to fight a war in their own territory against an even more powerful adversary. As he so often did, Sarmoli took to the EVE Online forums to announce his campaign against Goon Swarm in one of the most famous posts ever. I quote, "There are no goons. This is as personal as it will ever get. Goodbye." What happened next could barely be called a battle. Band of Brothers arrived at the Goons' home in Syndicate in vastly better ships with a veteran's command of the game. It steamrolled Goon Swarm and set up blockades around all of its stations in the regions. Band of Brothers wasn't preventing the Goons from entering the station, it was preventing them from leaving. For an entire week, Band of Brothers organized around-the-clock blockades to ensure no Goon could fly. The Goons, for their part, mostly wanted to wait out Band of Brothers to see if its pilots would get bored enough to leave. They made a hobby out of flying the cheapest ships in the game right into the waiting arms of Band of Brothers' blockade. Band of Brothers left the Goons' home after flexing for a week. Sarmoli couldn't eradicate Goon Swine entirely, but he'd made his point. Not everyone believes that Band of Brothers came to Syndicate just to get revenge for a despicable joke made by the Goon. I quote, "As soon as we demonstrated that we were a threat to the established order, Band of Brothers dropped what they were doing, concocted an excuse, and said that we were terrible people and a cancer of Eve, and that we needed to be removed from the game for the good of the community," said Goon Swarm's spy master, the Mittani, in 2014. He believes firmly that Band of Brothers' leadership was feigning offense as an excuse to attack the Goons. "There was a lot of clutching of pearls and cases of the vapors," he said. Regardless of the true casus belli, Goon Swarm had been stopped cold in Cloud Ring, and now was being hit in its home region. Dusk and Dawn would say it won the battle that counted the most by breaking the Goons in Cloud Ring. Band of Brothers would say it delivered the final blow in a vicious 1-2 combo. But Goon Swarm would also claim victory in this conflict, because for the Goons this was a proof of concept. The Goons were beaten and bloodied, but they showed they could go toe-to-toe with a major nullsec power, and even take their territory for a short time. They had proved that experience, skill, technology could be trumped by sheer numbers and willpower. This was the first time Goon Swarm and Band of Brothers had come to blows, but it wouldn't be the last. This small skirmish in Syndicate was the opening shot in what would become EVE's Online most historic rivalry, and which would one day come to shape the face of the game. But before the Goons could hope to challenge the strongest powers of nullsec, they needed to form alliances. They examined their options for political partnerships and reached out to the one group in the game who seemed to have everything the Goons could want in an ally: the Russians. This is end of chapter 11, and I think this is where I'm gonna call it. So I hope you guys enjoy that. Tune in next week for the next episode. As always, we're about a little bit past the halfway mark of this book. If anyone has any suggestion on what we should be reading after this book is done in the next few weeks, then let me know, either in the comments, on the forum post, or anywhere. And I hope you all have a great day. Yeah, definitely flew by Atlanta. It definitely went pretty fast. Thank you very much for tuning in on Twitch. You have yourself a great day, everyone. Bye bye.